Sexual Violence, 1950-1980, and the guest curator of Confronting Violence, Improving Women's Lives exhibition with the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland, which was on its way from September 2015 to August 2016. Her research focuses on 20th century U.S. social movements, sexual violence, anti-rape activism, and rape law. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacquet.
Thank you, and thanks so much, everybody, for being here this morning. That's just been incredible, and I'm so honored to be here amongst a rock star group of scholars. So, my book examines the history of anti-rape activism during the mid-20th century, and as a historian, I'm interested in questions of how and why people take up an issue and fight for change, whether that is as individuals, in small or local groups, or by situating themselves within larger social justice movements. And for the book, I was interested in looking at how people define sexual violence historically, whose accounts were deemed politically relevant and why, and how those definitions impacted both the scope and kinds of responses to rape. And what history has taught me is that when we neglect the full scope of the problem, and when we neglect particular victims, we do incredible harm. So as an activist scholar, committed to imagining and creating a world where sexual violence is finally eradicated, an inclusive definition of rape is non-optional. We need expansive frameworks that include everyone, women, girls, men, boys, and by that I mean both cis and trans people. We need to include queer and non-binary people. In other words, we need to include all people as victims across gender, race, sexuality, and so on. And we need responses that truly address the issue, right, rather than creating further harm. Of course, that's the trickiest part, and it's something we've been talking about this morning, thinking about restorative justice as opposed to our very flawed criminal legal system. And so these issues of how we define sexual violence today and how we effectively respond are issues that we struggle with, we continue to struggle with, and they're issues that anti-rape activists struggled with decades ago. And so on that note, we're going to turn our attention to the 1970s. So today I'm going to start with the stories of two people whose lives were worlds apart, but who both had life-changing experiences at the intersections of rape and race, class, and gender. In February of 1974, Delbert Tibbs was traveling through Florida when he was questioned by state police about the rape of a white woman and the murder of her boyfriend. And while Tibbs did not fit the description of the assailant, except for a shared racial identity, he was arrested, brought to trial, wrongfully convicted, and sentenced to death. And this is a photo of Tibbs decades later. Tibbs' story was reflective of a long history of injustice, where black men were either falsely accused or overly punished for interracial rape. And cases like these were not limited to the Jim Crow South, but some of the most notorious cases emerged from Southern courts. The same year that Tibbs was arrested, Linda Scott, a black sex worker, alleged that Pete Cole, a white middle-class man, had brutally raped her in Dallas. At the October trial, Pete Cole did not take the stand, nor was he required to. Yet Scott, the victim, was questioned relentlessly for hours about her sexual history, and ultimately the all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict. And this here is a photo in a courtroom drawing of Pete Cole. Linda Scott's story is reflective of a long history of injustice where the majority of women rape victims across race face excessively harsh treatment in the courts. As a black woman, she was further subjected to the scrutiny of her gender at the intersection of her race. So, what do these two stories have in common, besides taking place in 1974? Both Tibbs and Scott were members of groups that had historically encountered little to no justice in the courts. Tibbs, the innocent black defendant, and Scott, the mistreated victim, were the latest in long histories of injustice in American rape trials. And both Tibbs and Scott also found support from activists who were mobilizing against the injustices of rape. By the mid-1970s, activists in both the Black Freedom Movement and the Women's Liberation Movement had launched major campaigns confronting the inadequacies of the legal, medical, and social responses to rape. And these activists and their mobilizations are the focus of my book. All available on iTunes. Amazon. So the book chronicles the way in which activists identified sexual violence as a critical site of injustice and the strategies that they developed to respond to that injustice. During this time period, activists defended black men in the courts, sometimes saving their lives. They claimed black women's rights to bodily autonomy, demanded that women victims be heard and believed, and exposed the inadequacies of the legal and medical systems. Activists identified and disputed rape myths that fueled the prevalence and trauma of rape. They successfully reformed rape laws and medical protocols, and they challenged the prevailing views on race and gender that had contributed to the larger injustices of rape. And the unrelenting work and advocacy by activists, scholars, and lawyers profoundly altered the national response to sexual violence. For an observer in the late 1970s, the legal, medical, and cultural understandings and responses to rape had made a radical and undeniable shift from 30 years prior. Now, while activists in both the Black liberation and women's liberation movements organized major campaigns in response to rape, there was no unified anti-rape coalition across movements during this stretch of time. And in fact, there were sometimes quite different, significant differences in the dominant discourses on rape that were coming out of the Black freedom and women's liberation movements. Racial and gender justice activists came to their anti-rape analyses from their own respective frameworks of injustice, and this had very important consequences for anti-rape campaigns, who activists supported, the injustices they identified, and the kind of changes that they sought. The dominant discourses that activists produced were based on what theorists now call single-axis frameworks, and while those resulted in profoundly important changes for some, they also came with their own set of limitations. The larger Black freedom movement politicized rape as a tool of white supremacy. Theorizing rape within a larger framework of racism, activists concentrated their attention solely on interracial sexual violence. Mobilization efforts centered on Black women assaulted by white men, as well as Black men either falsely accused or excessively punished for raping white women. These efforts were necessary and critically important. Yet there were limitations. First, the politicization of rape as racial injustice left out the largest group of Black rape victims, and those were Black women assaulted by Black men. And second, racial justice activists sometimes reinforced sexist beliefs and rape myths about victims in their defense of Black men. So this would have detrimental impacts on all victims, including women of color. Likewise, within the predominantly white women's movement of the 1970s, feminist activists initially politicized rape almost exclusively within a larger framework of sexism and gender injustice. And this reflected a tendency within the women's movement at the time to focus on gender as the primary cause of oppression in women's lives, excluding other social factors such as race and class. Using this analytical frame, white feminists theorized rape only as the result of sexism and male supremacy. Thus, any woman assaulted by any man was politically salient to the movement, regardless of race. Now, this opened up space for addressing both intraracial and interracial sexual violence. However, most white feminists involved in anti-rape campaigns focused their energy solely on women victims, and by the way, there was almost no comprehension or attention to male victims of rape or men victims of rape. And they did not typically consider Black men who were victims of legal injustice, whether they be falsely accused or excessively punished on rape charges. So this framework did not challenge the racism inherent in the criminal legal system, and this would have detrimental impacts, obviously not only on Black men, but also on women of color who experience various forms of violence at the hands of the state. Now, while the work of movement activists during these years was critically important, and I'm absolutely not suggesting otherwise, the single-axis frameworks that informed the activism ultimately limited the reach of these social justice movements. And so as I show in the book, solutions to rape that did not use an intersectional framework sometimes resulted in re-entrenchment of long-term oppression and injustice. However, many activists at the time were aware of this possibility, and they recognized the limitations of the single-axis framework. And in today's talk, I'm going to focus on those activists who did challenge the dominant discourses and who called for an intersectional approach to the politics of rape. I want to make a note here now that the term of this intersectional framework was developed and theorized by feminists of color. including Black women and Latinx, Native, and Asian women, amongst others. So although my research is looking specifically at activists in the Black freedom movement, an intersectional lens is the work of women of color more broadly, who worked in coalition with one another. So while we typically conceptualize the Black freedom and women's liberation movements as two distinct movements for social justice, activists themselves belie such a neat delineation. Black feminists, for example, articulated an analysis of rape that sat at the intersection of both of these movements, and these activists challenged the distinctions between a racial justice and a gender justice agenda, arguing instead that true racial justice included an analysis of patriarchal oppression, while true gender justice included an analysis of racism and white supremacy. Activists like these push their movements to expand their anti-rape analyses and account for both racial and gender injustice. However, this approach, as I mentioned, was not foregrounded by either the Black liberation or the women's liberation movement, and this lack of attention to intersectionality is what would lead to major contestations both within social justice movements and between them. So I'm going to show you what that looked like for the remainder of my talk today, and I will now turn to those examples. Okay. I don't mean to hide behind the podium, but I just want to stay close to the mic so that everybody could hear. So my first example is the case of the Tarboro Three. In this case, 3 young Black men were convicted and sentenced to death for the rape of a white woman in Tarboro, North Carolina in August of 1973. From a racial justice perspective, this was yet another case of a white woman falsely alleging rape against Black men. The convictions of all 3 reflected a racist legal tradition, historically hostile to Black men, and protective of white interests. From a gender justice perspective, the racism implicit in the case was also problematic. Yet some feminists were also concerned with the rhetoric about the alleged victim that reflected a cultural tradition of suspicion and hostility towards all women who came forward following sexual assault. So with sources documenting both movement responses, this case offers a unique look at divergent social movement politics on rape in the 1970s. So this is the 3 men who would be known as the Tarboro Three. On the evening of August 5th, 1973, 22-year-old Vernon Brown, 23-year-old Bobby Hines, and 23-year-old Jessie Lee Walston offered a ride to a young white woman who they found walking down a road just outside of Tarboro. The 22-year-old woman remained nameless in all published accounts. The woman had an argument with her boyfriend earlier that night, left his car, and was walking alone. She willingly accepted the ride with Brown, Hines, and Walston. While in the car, all 3 of the men had sexual intercourse with the woman. They then dropped her off near her home. She took herself to the emergency room at Edgecombe General Hospital and claimed rape. At the December 1973 trial, Brown, Hines, and Walston did not deny having sex with the woman. The 3 claimed that yes, she made advances toward them, but she willingly submitted to sexual intercourse. The accuser, however, claimed that while she had willingly accepted the ride, the sex was not consensual, and that she did not fight them because she was afraid of being killed. On December 9th, 1973, a jury of 11 men and 1 woman found the 3 guilty as charged. At the time, North Carolina had a mandatory death penalty sentencing structure, and all 3 were sentenced to death. As one New York Times reporter commented, the presiding judge had no choice but to pronounce the death penalty, and the executions for all 3 was scheduled for January 10th, 1974. Now, the death penalty was and continues to be a critical issue for racial justice activists nationwide. Black men accounted for 87% of those executed for rape between 1930 and 1965, and these were always on interracial rape charges. The death penalty was a particularly salient issue in North Carolina, a state that had more prisoners on death row than any other state in the nation in December of 1973. And not only was the state's capital punishment law deemed the harshest in the nation, but the majority of those on North Carolina's death row were Black men, not surprisingly. So for the supporters of the Tarboro Three, this intersection of race and the death penalty was the defining issue in the case. Recalling a history of racial discrimination in sentencing for rape, one lawyer commented, quote, "This seems the typical case. that justifies claims that the crime of rape is designed to punish blacks only. In Baltimore, the black newspaper, The Afro-American, reported that several civil rights groups conducted a series of protest marches here to support, here in Baltimore, to show support for the men and to protest the death penalty, contending it was used unfairly against blacks. Speaking to the discrimination in sentencing more broadly, Reverend Finlater of the Pullen Memorial Baptist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, said, "It just so happens that in North Carolina, everyone who's waiting on death row is black, poor, illiterate, or disadvantaged. People who have money or influence never get the death penalty here." So making the connection between race, class, and punishment, advocates for racial justice rallied to the cause of the Tarboro Three. Given the severity of the punishment and the defendant's claims to innocence, mobilization efforts to save Brown, Hines, and Walston began almost immediately following their sentencing. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, spearheaded the legal defense. The SPLC was an Alabama-based social justice organization founded in 1971 by Alabama lawyer and businessman Morris Dees, and Dees was joined by Montgomery lawyer Joe Levin. And the organization, which continues to exist and do incredible work today, it was created to ensure that the promise of the civil rights movement became a reality for all. Levin and Dees pursued legal cases pro bono that centered on racial and economic discrimination, and the organization's first president was Julian Bond, who was a co-founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So as a case involving poor black men, the plight of the Tarboro Three was an obvious choice for the organization. Within a month of the guilty verdict, Morris Dees met with the parents of the three young men, and the organization assumed responsibility for the case. The case garnered additional support from individuals and groups within and outside of North Carolina, including the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, local groups, statewide groups, racial justice groups. Following letter writing campaigns and organized protests and rallies in Tarboro and Raleigh, North Carolina, the state governor, Jim Holshouser, granted last-minute stays of execution to the three convicted men. So over the course of the next 18 months, the SPLC is going to relentlessly appeal the convictions to the North Carolina courts. Now, there's no indication that any feminist groups, or explicitly feminist groups, rallied behind Brown, Walston, and Hines. But the case did come to the attention of some feminist anti-rape activists, and these feminists are going to raise concerns with a fundraising letter that's written by Julian Bond during the arduous appeals process. So, in his letter, and I don't expect you to be able to read it, it's just so there's an image. Bond explained, this is Julian Bond's fundraising letter. So he explained that three innocent men have been sentenced to die in North Carolina's gas chamber, accused of a crime which stirs up the ugliest depths of anti-black hatred and prejudice, the rape of a white woman. Bond insisted on the innocence of Brown, Hines, and Walston. As evidence of this, he wrote that the three had dropped the woman off within a block of her home. Bond asked his readers, why would men who had supposedly just raped a woman extend such a courtesy to their alleged victim? Additionally, in contrast to what Bond termed the usual victim of rape, the woman showed no signs of physical injury upon examination at the hospital. Finally, Bond commented that the day after the alleged rape, the three men went about their normal activities. He asked, is this how the perpetrators of such a terrible crime would behave? So from Bond's perspective, it was clear that the woman was not a true rape victim, and that this was yet another case of a white woman's false claim and a legal system's racist response. So the editors of the Washington, D.C.-based newsletter, the Feminist Alliance Against Rape, published Bond's letter in their April-May 1975 issue. Following that letter, the editors also printed a response from Nancy Baker of the Eugene, Oregon Rape Prevention Center. And in their introduction to the two letters, the editors wrote that while they were encouraged by other radical groups who were becoming involved in rape cases, I guess they forgot the history of organizing by the LDF, but they felt that they had the responsibility to confront other people committed to change when they exhibit sexist attitudes. And in her response to Bond, Nancy Baker did just that. Speaking on behalf of the Eugene Rape Prevention Center, Baker began by assuring their support and solidarity with Bond's view against racism and racist oppression in the courts. She disagreed, however, with Bond's view of rape. In her words, she said it's, quote, necessary to confront you on the sexist ideology and myths about rape that you present in your defense and the appeal for support regarding this case. Reiterating that she did not support the execution of the three men, Baker commented that in their case, rape is not even being dealt with, she said. It seems to be a pawn in the death game of three black men. She was concerned with the myths about rape that Bond perpetuated in his letter. In response to Bond's assertion that real rapists would not courteously drop off a woman near her home, Baker argued that rapists could indeed be courteous, and, quote, most men believe it is their right to rape a woman. Secondly, taking issue with Bond's characterization of a usual victim of rape, Baker asserted that physical injury did not prove or disprove consent. She explained, in rape cases, especially when more than one rapist is concerned, a woman will many times give in to avoid any physical harm which may come to her should she resist. The fact that this woman had no physical injuries, therefore, did not discredit her allegation. Finally, Baker rejected Bond's conclusion that all three were innocent because they went about their normal activities the next day. Baker asked, quote, since when is rape traumatic for the rapist? If men believe it's normal and it's their right, why should they act out of the ordinary once they have committed a rape? That's a good question. Baker's feminist analysis of the case sharply contrasted with Bond's proofs of innocence. It was necessary, Baker concluded, to look at both of the issues realistically, seeing not only the overt racism in the case, but the whole problem of rape and sexism as well, which, to use her words, would make it easier to attack the crux of the problem, which is racism, by dealing with the deviously intertwined rape. The same system of thought that produced and maintained the racist myth of the black rapist also produced and maintained sexist rape myths. This system, Baker argued, permits and encourages the oppression of all people who are not white middle-class men. Commenting that those in power used myths as tools of oppression, Baker wrote, racism and sexism are the product of the same system of thought. We cannot use those tools against each other. Finally, she urged Bond to reject sexist tools of oppression, concluding, you cannot fight racism by perpetuating the myths that allow rape to exist. Baker's letter stands out for its intersectional analysis and attention to multiple histories of injustice. Analyses like these were typically not at the forefront of either the Black or women's liberation movement discourses on rape. However, they're important indicators not only of the variety of ways that activists theorize rape, but also the potential dangers of narrowly defined anti-rape politics. So the conflict between Baker and Bond is reflective of a unique 1970s perspective on rape, emerging from two social movements that sought to dispel the myths of sexual violence and find justice for those they supported. Feminists struggled against legal, medical, and social norms that discounted most women's claims of rape, and in seeking to support survivors, feminists sought to show that rape was real. This obviously clashed with the counter-narrative of the lying white woman offered by some racial justice activists in their defense of black men. And while indeed there were white women who falsely accused black men, we know many of these cases, the notorious cases like Scottsboro, etc., the false claim itself was a dangerous construction. Legal authorities have relied on it for decades to deny justice to women victims of rape. That includes both white women and women of color. And so rather than fueling the myths that maintained white male power, Baker hoped that activists for social justice could recognize the destructive impact of both racist and sexist discourse and seek mutually productive ways to fight against both rape and racism. And there's no indication that Bond ever replied to Baker's letter, or if he ever read it. So ultimately, the Tarboro Three win their appeal. Following months of protests and legal battles, the North Carolina State Supreme Court granted Brown, Hines, and Walston a new trial. On May 19, 1975, the defense reached a settlement, so the three young men pleaded no contest to the charge of assault with intent to rape. They each received a 6-year suspended sentence, and on August 8, 1975, the three were released from prison. Okay, so while feminists feminists contested the oversight of some racial justice approaches to rape. Others contested a feminist interpretation that failed to account for the histories of injustice against Black men. And the responses to Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will most clearly demonstrates this critique. So Susan Brown Miller was a white feminist activist who had come to consciousness about rape during the early 1970s. She was a very active member of the New York Radical Feminists, and following a rape speak out and conference organized by that group, she began researching the history of rape, and she was the first person to do so. In 1975, she published Against Our Will with Simon & Schuster to great acclaim. So here she traced the history of rape from biblical times to the modern-day U.S. women's movement, exposing the prevalence of sexual violence across world history and arguing that the threat and fear of rape had consistently oppressed women. Brown Miller's was the first book-length manuscript on sexual violence from a feminist perspective to break into the mainstream press. It put a feminist understanding of rape firmly into the minds of thousands of readers nationwide, and it's largely credited with putting rape into the public and popular discourse. For many, Brown Miller's book stood as symbolic of the women's liberation movement approach to rape as a whole. And while this was not actually the case, the feminist anti-rape movement was quite varied in its approaches and solutions to rape. Brown Miller became the leading feminist voice on sexual violence following the publication of her book. She spoke at dozens of colleges nationwide, authored articles on rape and violence against women in popular magazines like Family Circle, Glamour, Mademoiselle, and Time even named her one of the magazine's People of the Year in 1975. So, in Against Our Will, Brown Miller harshly criticized the use of the false claim in the defense of Black men, using well-known and controversial interracial rape cases from the previous 50 years, including Scottsboro. Brown Miller challenged what she considered the, quote, tremendous distortions the left was using to clear Black men. She argued that the use of the trope of the lying white woman by the left, liberals, and defenders of civil liberties reinforced a sexist legal tradition of, quote, destroying the credibility of the complaining witness by smearing her as a mentally incompetent or as a sexually frustrated or an oversexed promiscuous whore. From the biblical stories of Potiphar's wife to modern psychoanalytical theory that made its way into legal doctrine, the lying woman loomed large in popular and legal understandings of rape. Brown Miller sharply criticized the left for embracing this rape myth in their defense of Black men. Prominent women leaders from the left wing of the racial justice movement, some who identified as feminists, stood amongst Brown Miller's harshest critics. Most notably, political activist and scholar Angela Davis, in a 1978 Black Scholar article, argued that Brown Miller's arguments resuscitated what she called the time-worn myth of the Black rapist. Davis argued that Brown Miller's provocative distortion of historical Black-on-white rape cases was, quote, designed to dissipate any sympathy for Black men who are victims of fraudulent rape charges. Davis called for an intersectional politics of rape that supported victims while also working against historical racist tropes of the Black beast rapist. Similarly, in a 1976 open letter to Southern white women, civil rights veteran and Southern Conference Education Fund organizer Ann Braden critiqued Brown Miller's disregard for the realities of racism. With her own personal experiences fighting against racial injustice in cases of Black-on-white rape, Braden was particularly offended by Brown Miller's views. Braden had been actively involved in a campaign to save Willie McGee, a Black man accused and subsequently executed by the state of Mississippi in 1951 for allegedly raping a white woman. Braden later joined the campaign to free Thomas Wainsley, a Black man imprisoned in 1961 on a charge of rape by a white woman in Virginia. Braden saw the white female accusers of both McGee and Wainsley as tragic women of the South, used as tools of hate and pawns of a system that perpetuated the racist myth of Black rape. In her open letter, Braden responded directly to Brown Miller's views on the false claim, arguing, quote, racism is not some abstract concept invented by the left for its own gain. It does exist. The rape cases inspired action and became famous because they exemplified the terrorism which upheld political and economic power relationships in the South. So while Braden acknowledged the benefits of Brown Miller's broader analysis, She argued that her arguments on black-on-white rape could be used as weapons of racism. Now, the sharpest critique of Brown Miller came in response to her consideration of the Emmett Till case. For black and white Americans nationwide, the 1955 murder of Till in Money, Mississippi, came to symbolize the treachery and severity of black oppression in the American South. A Chicago native, 14-year-old Till was in Money that summer visiting his uncle, and until recently, the popular told story of his death began with an encounter with local white shopkeeper Carolyn Bryant, and this is Emmett Till and Carolyn Bryant here. One day, several of Till's friends had dared him to ask Carolyn out on a date. Supposedly, Till walked into the store and did that. Carolyn Bryant chased after him with a pistol in her hand. In response, Till supposedly wolf whistled back at her. Bryant's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, came for Till at his uncle's shack at 2 a.m. the next morning. Till never returned. Several days later, a fisherman pulled Till's severely beaten body out of the Tallahatchie River. Till had a gunshot wound to the head and a face mutilated beyond recognition. An all-white, all-male jury acquitted both Bryant and Millam shortly thereafter. Now, Timothy Tyson's recently released book on the murder, The Blood of Emmett Till, reveals new evidence about what had happened, including Carolyn Bryant's admission to Tyson in a 2008 interview that she had lied on the stand about the details of her interaction with Till. Bryant further told Tyson, quote, "Nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him." Cool, thanks, Carolyn. I'm sorry, forgive me. So that's the story we know now. Bryant had yet to break her silence in the 1970s when Brown Miller was writing. So in Against Our Will, Brown Miller condemned the murder of Till, commenting that, quote, "Nothing in recent times can match it for sheer outrageousness, for indefensible overkill with community support." Yet, Brown Miller's approach to the case took a significant turn from the usual race-centered analysis. She argued that Till's wolf whistle was more than a kid's brash prank, and his murder was more than a husband's revenge. Focusing on the gender dynamics at play, Brown Miller argued that the Till case exposed, quote, "the underlying group male antagonisms over access to women." Acknowledging that a whistle was no justification for murder, Brown Miller argued that Emmett Till and Roy Bryant, quote, "shared something in common. They both understood that the whistle was no small tweet of hubba hubba or melodious approval for a well-turned ankle. It was a deliberate insult just short of physical assault, a last reminder to Carolyn Bryant that this black boy, Till, had in mind to possess her," end quote. So in other words, Till and his murderers shared a deracialized male privilege, and they both viewed Carolyn Bryant as property. In attempting to explain the Till case from the vantage point of male dominance, Brown Miller de-emphasized the racial context of a deeply segregated and white supremacist South. She understood the insult implicit in Emmett Till's whistle, quote, as the depersonalized challenge of "I can have you," with or without racial aspect. This is a 3-page section of Brown Miller's book. It's only 3 pages out of like 250 some odd pages. But this was perhaps the most explosive and most controversial portion of the entire book, and a lot of folks only know this portion of the book. Angela Davis castigated Brown Miller for perpetuating racist ideology and depicting Till as a guilty sexist, almost as guilty as his white racist murderers. Davis further argued that Brown Miller's interpretation invites us, as her words, invites us to infer that if this 14-year-old boy had not been shot in the head and dumped in the Tallahatchie River after he whistled at one white woman, he probably would have succeeded in raping another white woman. For Davis, who remembered feeling terrorized by the Emmett Till case as an 11-year-old girl living in the South, analyzing this prominent civil rights case without a racial justice lens was both outrageous and dangerous. Davis and Ann Braden were particularly critical of what they deemed Brown Miller's narrow, single-issue lens on rape. They condemned her exclusive focus on women victims and subsequent denial of the racist use of the false claim. This fueled white supremacy. As Davis argued, Brown Miller's quote, failure to alert white women about the urgency of combining a fierce challenge to racism with the necessary battle against sexism is an important plus for the forces of racism today. From the perspective of racial justice, not recognizing and responding to the continued history of injustice for Black men also failed Black women. As one Black audience member asked Brown Miller in a speaking engagement, "What you are saying may help me protect myself, but how can I protect my son?" In her published letter, Anne Braden commented, "A movement that has no answer to that question ignores the fact that in society anchored by racism, there can be no liberation for anyone until the race issue is met head-on." Like Nancy Baker, activists like Davis and Braden challenged anti-rape activists to combine the fight against sexism with the fight against racism, discourses and methods that fail to account for the way that rape charges have been used to oppress Black men weakened anti-rape activism as a whole. Now, in truth, the larger feminist movement did not give significant attention to the history of the frame-up rape charge. In a legal and social atmosphere that overwhelmingly doubted the existence of rape and denied justice to all women of all racial backgrounds as a matter of course, most feminist anti-rape activists had their focus solely on women as victims and not Black men. And this focus on victims is perhaps not surprising, considering that the FBI Uniform Crime Reports estimated in 1973 the rates of successful prosecution were at approximately 14%. So I interviewed Susan Brown Miller at her home in New York for this book project. That was pretty cool. So when I asked her why the feminist anti-rape movement did not rally around Black men, she told me, "We were doing one thing. We were saying rape is real. It exists." And encountering centuries of suspicion of most rape victims, many feminist activists could not conceive of supporting Black men without undermining their own movement. Holding space for both of those realities posed significant challenges. Feminist anti-rape activist and former member of Santa Cruz Women Against Rape, Robin McDuff, explained this to me this way in a phone call. She said, "We believed the women, and we also noticed historically how the issue of rape had been used against Black men. You can't really integrate those." So further commenting on this impasse of political perspectives, McDuff pointed out the inherent contradiction in saying women were never lying about rape except in this one little situation right here, right? So with a single focus on women as victims, the larger feminist movement failed to adopt an approach to combating rape that included both women victims and those falsely accused. And this lack of intersectional analysis produced considerable alarm for many activists in the 1970s, particularly as anti-rape work became increasingly dominated by state reform efforts. But that's a story for another day. You can all read about it in my book. You'll go running to buy the book after the talk. So, in contrast to the dominant discourses which emerged from the Black liberation and women's liberation movements, some activists sought a recognition of the interconnectedness of rape and racism, and solutions to sexual violence that combated both racist and sexist oppression. And these activists exposed the limitations of single-access frameworks and consistently pushed for inclusive analyses of both racial and gender justice. Women of color, and most notably Black feminists, were consistently at the forefront of this analysis. So I just want to end the talk very briefly by talking about some of that work. Some 20 years later, in the early 2000s, women of color were still making the same appeals for an intersectional approach to justice. So by the turn of the 21st century, women of color continued this uphill battle against what they called the mainstream anti-violence movement, which was focused on working with the state rather than working against state violence. At the same time, they continued to confront calls from racial justice organizers to remain silent about their victimization to maintain a, quote, united front against racism, right? So they're really finding themselves at these intersections of racial and gender justice. In April of 2000, over 2,100 activists of color gathered at the University of California, Santa Cruz for the Color of Violence conference, which focused specifically on violence against women of color. And the conference was a profound moment in the history of anti-violence movement, and produced these opportunities for radical social justice analyses and to reignite the movement to end violence against women. This momentum from the Color of Violence conference led to 2 follow-up conferences, a 15-year anniversary conference, and the formation of the group Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. Within a few years, Insight was the largest grassroots multiracial feminist organization in the United States. They sought and they continue to seek a reconceptualization of anti-violence strategies based in an intersectional approach to justice. And as members of Insight explain, the challenge women of color face in combating personal and state violence is to develop strategies for ending violence that do assure the safety for survivors of sexual and domestic violence and do not strengthen our oppressive criminal justice apparatus. And this remains at the core of intersectional feminist anti-violence organizing today. And on that note, I will end, and I'm happy to discuss. Sally has a question. Bring it on.
One of the other examples in the book that you didn't talk about is the Joan Little case.
Yes.
And it's not as a less oppositional way, but this was an example where social movements actually came together with a common cause. However, what I really like about, one of the many things I really like about the book is the way you do the social movement thing with the discourse analysis.
Yeah.
But at the end, even though it's a happy story of social movements not working against each other so much,
Yeah.
from a discursive point of view, it's the story of the frame of the bad old South is what
Oh, the
is
Joanne Little story.
the Joanne
Yeah,
Little
yeah.
story versus the women's self-defense.
Right.
You know, so do you think about, is there any way you think the women's self-defense discourse could have been more effectively advanced through some sort of better social movement cooperation or discursive analysis, or is it always going to be the case that you know, that these tropes, whether it's lying woman, bad old South, are just sort of unassailable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the Joanne Little case, this was an incarcerated black woman who was assaulted by her white jailer, and she kills him with an ice pick and claims self-defense, and then is hunted down, and then goes into hiding, is hunted down by the state of North Carolina. Anyway, she is acquitted, and it's like this incredible moment in the history of violence against women because she's actually acquitted. But while you do have feminists rally around the case, prisoners' rights activists rally around the case, racial justice activists, of course those are not mutually exclusive categories. Everybody's rallying around the case, but for somewhat different reasons, right? Like how they understand Joanne as a victim, and the main rhetoric that's being thrown around is like, you're the racist old South, this rinky-dink town, right? And then, this woman is like fighting for self-defense. So I think it's hard to break out of those tropes, and I don't think that's the problem with the criminal justice system, or the criminal legal system, as I call it. I don't know that there is an effective way to combat sexual, in a system that's inherently racist and sexist. How do you find justice within that system? I don't know that it's possible, and it relies on all those kinds of tropes. So I don't know if there is a way to break out of that and find justice. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Yes.
So I so appreciate your talk, and it's just personally come at a good time for me because I just recently read Danielle McGuire's book.
The best.
Yeah,
oh
and
my
then
God.
Revisited some of Patricia Hill Collins' work, also kind of on this issue of you have African American women who are being victims of rape by white men and they're not getting justice, and then you also have African American men who are being falsely accused. I feel like when I think about what's happening today, do you feel like there is still an issue of racialized false accusations of rape against men, or has that shifted more to, I guess, other crimes that they tend to be now accused of falsely? Because I feel like we do hear a lot about the issue of, our criminal justice system. There's still a huge issue of African American men being falsely accused of crimes, but it seems like maybe there is less of an issue of rape being the type of crime that they're accused of, if that makes sense, or do you think there is still a threat of that that's happening today?
I think when people imagine the rapist, I think most people are imagining a person of color.
Yeah.
You definitely have overrepresentation of people of color in the carceral system across all crimes. So I don't know if that whole mythology of like the black rapist has dissipated at all.
Right.
It would be an interesting question to do studies on, but I don't think so. I don't know. Yeah.
Can I just tag?
Yes, please,
here?
tag.
So if you look at the cases of exoneration,
Yeah.
there are a very significant number of rape cases, partly because there was DNA evidence, so, it's not
The
as
central
that way.
archive.
Right, exactly, but there have been a number of cases of black men accused of raping white women in particular, and part of that's an interracial ID identification issue. But that would be one place to look.
Yeah, to look, yeah.
I know this is a little beyond what you did your research on, so it's understandable if you don't have an answer to this question. But one thing that we know historically in the present time is that when people go against stereotype, they're punished more harshly. So when women kill their husbands, they're sentenced to longer terms than when men kill their wives because there's something normal about men engaging in that behavior, right? And so I'm wondering if, as you look at sex crimes historically, and I'm thinking that maybe the evidence would come in sex crimes against children, where it might be more common, if there are examples when women are perpetrators, that they are sentenced to harsher terms because they're going against stereotype, but that's not what we anticipate. Or I'm thinking more recently about high school teachers who get caught having sex with students that were particularly scandalized when women teachers have relationships with male students.
Especially the women teachers. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a really interesting question. I mean, it makes me think of like people like, white folks, like white racial justice activists who are like race traitors, so they're like particularly, punished more harshly. It's the same idea, right? People who are stepping outside the boundaries of how they're supposed to behave. But I wonder, Stephen Robertson has written about, it's called Crimes Against Children in New York City at the turn of the century, and I wonder if he says anything about that, but I don't know, it's a great question. Yeah.
Well, so I believe you said this, that black women have historically had difficulties being seen as legitimate victims, and many more stereotyped rape myths have been asserted against them. I don't know offhand what the statistics are, but rape tends to be an intra-racial crime.
Yes, correct.
So I think what I was wondering if you got into it all was, what we still see today, a lot of pressure on black, well, this is true in a number of groups, but in this context, of black women who feel like they cannot report because then they're a race traitor.
That's right. Yeah, it'll do a disservice to the race. And this is something that people like Crenshaw has written about. A lot of folks talk about this issue and the pressures put on black women to remain silent. And this is something, too, that the women of Insight talk about, to maintain the unity of the race. Just exactly. And that's, this is exactly where black feminist analysis is talking about, like, being left, black women at the margins who are, supposed to, not talk about these things. Or as one activist that I interviewed, Zahara Simmons, said, we're not supposed to air out our dirty laundry, because what is that going to do? And also then, will that help fuel this larger myth of, the violent black male? So it's absolutely continues to be a very, very difficult issue. Very, very tricky problem. Yeah.
On that, I just want to make a plug for a former student of mine, Jennifer Gomez, has developed a very powerful theory, cultural betrayal trauma theory, and I would really encourage people to just Google cultural betrayal trauma theory, because she's also been able to measure some of the additional burden that women in marginalized communities pay when they have been sexually violated by another member of that community, and she understands it in terms of the societal oppression and the pressure on the group. It's really great work.
Oh, that's great, good, that'll be good, yeah, that's good to know. So cultural betrayal theory?
This is cultural betrayal trauma theory.
Trauma theory, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's something too that, women in the 1970s were talking about, when the New York radical feminists held their speak out on rape. One of the women who talked was a black identified woman, and she talked about her rape by, she said, a third world man, because that was the language folks were using. He was Puerto Rican at the time. And she talked about in her speak out how she felt like she couldn't call the police because that would be doing a disservice to the larger community of color, and it would only help fuel racism. And she felt that pressure to stay quiet. So yeah, it's definitely something that we saw historically and continue to see. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Just hearing you say that makes me think about a true analysis of the state. When white women are in these situations of rape, they can rely on the state, and black women cannot, which puts them in a kind of weird position in terms of if I report this, then I am subjecting this black man through this whole structure that isn't for me and is definitely not for him to harm. And so I'm curious if what kind of analysis have you done in terms of the state's role in this really complex intersection of race, sexism, and we're being able to rely on the state to handle these issues?
The state's not good. But this is the thing too, right? White women think they can rely on the state, right? It's not the case. the state is not, the state doesn't want to prosecute rape charges, and the state doesn't want to believe that rape is real. It's, so yeah, I don't know that we can rely on the state. I don't think, again, and that's why I think the conversations this morning about restorative justice and alternatives to the state are so important, because that's what we need, right? We have, the feminist anti-rape movement organized in the early 1970s. We have, now we're, 40 years of law reform later. What's changed? Not to be a total bummer, but honestly, you can change all the rape laws, you can do everything you want, and symbolically that was important work, but what does it actually do? And that women of color are subjected to violence at the hands of the state, right? This is what we find too, is that, rates of police violence against people of color and sexual violence, who are you going to call if you're raped by the cops? You can't call the cops, right? So
just to pursue that, so I guess, how was that missed in, that analysis missed in both parties? If they couldn't really come to, an understanding or compromise along the access of race and class, why not just say, the state isn't working for either of our parties, and that's where...
Well, the state did sometimes work. when you think about the work of NAACP, LDF lawyers to get black men off death row, to, exonerate them, it did work sometimes, right? But it's hard to have a strategy that both supports and defends those accused and supports and defends those who are accusing. You can't really have both of those things. But it's understandable, at the time, if you think about the context historically, right? And think about that Susan Brown Miller quote. She's we were trying to say that rape is real, it exists. People did not even want to believe that it was real. So to do all that work. There were women of color who were also very much involved with changing rape law and relying on the state. In New York, they had this horrifying corroboration requirement where you literally had to corroborate every element of the rape with eyewitness accounts, which come on. And women of color were very instrumental in changing that law. So I think what we can see now is obvious misses. Maybe at the time seemed less obvious, but there were enough people at the time who were y'all. I think about the black feminists doing that work in the 1970s who were come on, white women, who just were so focused on their gender from a white middle class point of view that they couldn't see it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I think historically Brown Miller's book came out earlier than Susan Estridge's book.
It did, yeah, because Estridge, I think, was 87 and Brown Miller 75.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there was a big
Yeah.
gap. So I think it's funny that Brown Miller adapts the real rape terminology to talk about what her book was in essence about.
Right.
Because having, been in this field actually, when both of those books came out,
Right.
I don't actually think about that as Brown Miller's most significant contribution.
Oh, no, I mean,
And I acknowledge that Susan was actually arguing about acquaintance rape being as real as stranger rape, so.
Right, Estridge, right. Yeah, I mean, Brown Miller's book was, I mean, it did so much, right? And I pull out those 3 pages, because it was the most, for like racial justice activists, that was what, was being focused on. But certainly that's not to undermine, all the tremendous research and work that she did, because it was absolutely
Well, I might have
incredible work in other
misunderstood,
ways.
what you said, because what I heard was attributed to the way Susan Brown Miller describes her own book.
That she's like reading Susan Estridge's 10 years later back into her work as its contribution. Which wasn't how she would have seen it at the time. That's what she's asking.
Brown Miller?
Yeah, by using that term, rapist real.
Oh, I
That's
see.
what she's saying, yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
That she's like reinterpreting what she was thinking.
What she was
Time
thinking
in
then,
light
and
of
just
Susan
given what
Estridge's
she's
book.
read afterwards. Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah. Well then,
Because actually, she did, like, as you said, so much more.
oh yeah, absolutely. Right. Well, I think, but the point is when she was saying that rape is real, because, as we know, I mean, feminists were coming up against the dismissal and denial of rape. So I think for her to say we were doing one thing, we were saying rape is real, is because at the time people really didn't think it was real, they didn't think it happened, right? I mean, that there's hundreds of stories that I've read from the archives, right, women talking about going to the police station and they're just laughing at them and being like, this didn't actually happen to you, this isn't real. Do you know what I mean? So I'm sure part of it might be her looking back, having read Estridge, but also I think one of the goals of the feminist anti-rape movement was to make people understand that rape actually existed, like it did actually happen.
Yeah, I saw, I mean, her book Susan's was an inspiration to me because I saw,
Yeah.
as her point, that
Yeah.
there is so much rape that is unknown to us,
Right.
that's hidden.
Absolutely.
And that was really what I felt was the challenge, to say, well, let's find it.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember I read Brown Miller in 1999 for the first time. It was like, what? Like, whoa, mind blowing. Right? I mean, that was 25 years after it was published. So I think that absolutely that is the larger contribution. Is it just, it like puts it out for you.
I don't want to cut off a great discussion, but I do want to be mindful of time. We are right about at 1, and so I want to make sure that we have enough time for people to stretch their legs and come back for next session if they'd like to. But let's please give another round of applause.